In the wake of World War I, the American people were tired. They wanted peace and stability in what President Warren G. Harding called a return to normalcy. This actually meant a return to isolationism, nativism, and conservatism. In 1920, Republican Warren G. Harding was elected 29th President of the United States. His vice president was Calvin Coolidge. Harding's Secretary of Treasury was Andrew Mellon, who believed in laissez-faire economics. This means he believed in less government spending and less governmental regulation. The U.S. government passed the Fordney-McCumber tariff in 1922, which raised tariffs, a tax on imports, to their highest levels yet. This decision, although intended to help U.S. business, resulted in an economic slowdown. Meanwhile, on domestic issues, Harding faced serious problems. Harding's cabinet was made up of many of his friends from Ohio, the Ohio Gang, and they were involved in numerous scandals. The Teapot Dome scandal involved the Secretary of the Department of Interior, Albert B. Fall. He leased U.S. land in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hill, California, to two private oil drilling companies. Although Fall said that his deal was in the best interest of the United States, he soon came into $400,000 in assets. He was found guilty of bribery and sentenced to a year in prison. Just as these events were coming to light, Harding suffered what was probably a heart attack and died in 1923. Calvin Coolidge became president, at times referred to as Silent Cal because he said very little. Calvin Coolidge was noted for saying that, quote, "the chief business of the American people is business," end quote. He was a very popular president who kept taxes down and business profits up. He was easily reelected in 1924. Both Harding and Coolidge's foreign policy were heavily focused on the concept of isolationism. This is the policy of isolating one's country from the affairs of other nations by declining to enter into political alliances. At the Washington Naval Disarmament Conference, Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes recommended that no more warships be built. In 1928, 62 countries signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which stated war would no longer be policy. Nativism also increased at this time. Nativism is a policy that works to reduce the opportunities for newcomers or immigrants. Nativism, coupled with a growing fear of communism, also led to a state of hysteria known as the Red Scare. The fear of foreigners, the recent successful Russian Revolution, and the labor unrest in the United States fueled the fear that the communists were trying to take over. Several unexplained bombings tied to the Communist Party led Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to establish a special office to investigate. In late 1919 and early 1920, Palmer's forces invaded homes, arrested suspected radicals, communists, and anarchists, and deported hundreds of foreigners without trial. Nativists also influenced Congress to limit the number of immigrants coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Congress passed the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the National Origins Act of 1924. These laws were mainly intended to limit the number of Catholics and Jews entering the United States. Nativism also led to a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. During this time, membership grew to approximately 4.5 million. This new Klan not only terrorized African Americans, but also Catholics, Jews, and foreigners. This pervasive mentality that propagated suspicion of foreigners oftentimes ruined people's lives and reputations. One of the best examples of this is the Sacco and Vanzetti case. In 1920, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were convicted of murdering a paymaster and a security guard in Braintree, Massachusetts. Police suspicions centered on two local Italian anarchists. While neither Sacco nor Vanzetti had a criminal record, the authorities knew them as radicals. In 1921, the two men were convicted of the murders. However, many argue that they had been arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death simply because they were both radicals and immigrants. They were executed in 1927. A return to isolationism, nativism, and conservatism marked the political climate of the 1920s. However, Americans today continue to debate the validity of these ideals.